Hello everyone and welcome to the code alone video for the Stock Counselor project. Today we will work on the version 0.1 and hopefully by the end of it we will have our data gathering service working. Before we jump into the code, let's go over our directory structure. Our root directory is obviously gonna be Stock Counselor and its name will stay consistent except for the ending, right? Which will always indicate the version that we're currently working on. Right underneath it, we have the common directory. Now, the common directory is going to include files and classes and probably some enums and anything that is related to the code that is used eventually by more than one service, right? So today we're working on our data gathering service. However, in the next versions we will also have the recommender service and maybe some more. Obviously, they will all have something in common. For example, the logic to log the execution, right? So anything that is common to at least two services makes sense to put in a directory which we have named common. And moving along to the data gathering service directory. Well, actually, as you can see, it's a main service. Now, the reason for the word main is because we're going to split our data gathering service into two independent services, right? As you can see, the first one is gonna be main and the second one is going to be worker. We are doing the split in order to enable the backend tasks processing. If you're not familiar with what it is, right, you should probably see some tutorials or just Google backend tasks processing because it's a rather common practice. Our main service will receive requests from the users and map them to the backend tasks. Our worker service will watch for the newly arrived backend tasks and execute them. We need this technique in order to keep our main service always responsive. Jesus, what a word. Basically, any user will receive a response to any request from our main service in less than a second, because the actual work of gathering the data will be done by the worker service. Okay, enough about data gathering for now. The init file, Python just likes them, right? If you want any of your directory to be treated as a module and any code inside of it is something that you can import, well, you need these init files. The last but not the least is the main file, which is going to be the starting point of our Stock Counselor project. And I think we can dive right into it. Right now, there's nothing much going on here, and if our coding will be to the point in the future, it will stay this way, right? This file should stay small, tidy, and simple. So let's start with the dependencies. At line 1, we're importing the start data gathering main service method, which I guess is self-explanatory, from the data gathering main service module, which is our custom module, and it's treated like this. I mean, the directory is treated like module because of the init.py file. We are importing from the boundary API file, and the explanation of the name, we'll get to it a little bit later. At line number 2, we're asking from the sys module for argv. Argv is a list of command line arguments that are passed once we fire up our main.py file from the command line, right? From the CLI if it's Windows and bash if it's Linux. Sys is the module that comes with Python by default right after its installation, and it allows us to interact with the interpreter, which is precisely how we can access the command line arguments. And here comes the moment for our very first code line. Once Stack Counselor project is fired up, we would like to check for the name of the service that has been requested by the user. We're going to write a small conditional statement if argv at index 1 equals the name of our service, which is data gathering main service. We would like to execute the start data gathering main service method. It's important to know that we go straight to index 1 and not 0, because at index 0 we will have our file name that has been executed right now, which is main, and it doesn't really help us. So we start the check from index 1. Okay, cool. I suppose right now we can go to the data gathering main service directory and introduce it. So what's in it for us? Well, first of all, we've covered the init.py file, why it exists and what it does. The backend tasks API is going to provide a set of methods that will allow us to CRUD, right? Create, read, update, delete the backend tasks objects. Boundary and controller files are actually part of a design pattern, which is rather common, and it's named entity controller boundary. If you've never heard about it, or you're not sure what it does, I suggest you to Google it and look for some demo applications, because once again it's a rather common design pattern. I guess that given the fact that we've already used the stat data gathering main service method from our boundary API file, it should be the next one that we're going to implement. Our boundary file is obviously going to contain the boundary logic, which is responsible for communicating with a user, right? It will reveal an external API for the user to consume. How it's gonna do it? We will import the bottle module, right, and create a HTTP server. This way, an external user will be able to send requests to our application. Now, some of the user requests will be expected for an input, right? For example, the stock symbol, the symbol of the company at a stock exchange, right? And the input will be passed along to the controller logic, which in its place is actually going to create the backend tasks. So, what are the dependencies that we need? At line 7, as you can see, we're going to import from the bottle module the bottle application, request, and response. Bottle is basically a web framework written in Python. It's lightweight, it's very easy to use, the methods are short, and its documentation is short as well. It may not be appropriate for production, but once again, we're working on a prototype. Even if we are going eventually to upload it to the cloud, we obviously ain't gonna have like thousands of users per minute. So bottle meets our needs. Next in line is the controller class from the controller API file. We're going to skip the description about it for now, because we will have to implement it like in the near future. The datetime from the datetime module, well, it does precisely what it stands for. And now comes the functools module. This is an important topic. If you're not familiar with it, I strongly suggest not only to Google some explanation about it, but also to write your own custom code where you actually use the functools capabilities in order for the idea to sink in. Back to our case, we are importing the ROPs from the functools. Now, ROPs, well, you can look at it as sort of annotation which allows to decorate functions. We will get into more details and an actual example in a couple of moments when we have to implement the log to logger. If you take a look at line 32, there's a log to logger method, It receives function as an argument, and with the help of ROPS, we will add an additional execution logic to the function that was not originally intended. As for the last dependency, it is a couple of items from the login module. We are going to use login to preserve the execution details of our application. And I personally suggest always to write the execution details to a text file rather than showing them on the CLI, right, on the command line or bash output, because it's so easy to accidentally clear the console and then all of the details are gone, while text file is there to stay with you for a considerable amount of time. Cool. With the dependencies being covered and explained, we are ready to move on to the code, and we will start with the start data gathering main service method. Similar to the main.py file, it was divided into a couple of steps. Each step is commented and it explains what we're expected to do. So the very first step is setting up a logger. Now, although we have not yet written the proper method, we did declare it, right? So it's the SetupLogger method, and we are going to replace the pass with calling the SetupLogger execution. The next one is initializing our bottle app application. So we will need to create a variable app, and we will call the constructor of the bottle object. Now we would like to tell our bottle application how to log its execution details. Keep in mind that we are importing the bottle logic, so there's no way to access it directly, plus we should not do it. After all, we are not writing or rewriting the bottle source code, we are writing the stock counselor project. So what is the workaround here? Well, we are taking the app variable, calling this install method, and passing our log-to-logger function. Now, it's not implemented yet, but it is already declared. What happens here? Well, once our bottle application is going to invoke some method, it will be passed as a variable, as a argument to our log-to-logger function, which will decorate the passed function with additional execution steps that tell precisely how to log its execution details. And our log-to-logger method will return as an output a decorated function that will be executed by bottle application. And this is the workaround. This is where functools module capabilities are very helpful. Since we are talking about web server, there's obviously a step to configure the URLs, what to do with the HTTP requests. And the very first request that we will configure is a GET request that goes at the URL/monitor. The idea behind this request is very simple. It will the response is expected to return hello world or I'm alive or something like that. Basically, we're using this request just to see if our server is up, if it has not crashed because some dependencies are gone, or whatever, if it's ready for use. So we're gonna take our app and use the route method and specify the URL monitor. Now if the request comes here, we would like to execute the monitor method that is expected to return hello world. The next request is a little bit more interesting. So it's still a GET request. The URL is CollectStockData / as you can see, we have a parameter, right? A parameter inside the URL, acronym name, which represents the stock symbol, right? For example, if we would like to collect data about Microsoft, we would send a GET request to the /CollectStockData /MSFT instead of this parameter. And we're going to our app variable, right, using the route method, specifying the collect stock data URL, and our parameter is acronym name. Cool. If a request arrives at this URL, we're going to execute the method collect stock data, and its argument is going to be an acronym name. Now the bottle application knows to take this value and pass it as an argument to our function. So what happens inside of the collect stock data? First of all, this is the moment to initialize our controller object. We will be calling the controller constructor, and we have to pass the data gathering main service. Now, as you can see, we have a pop-up that this is a log ID, right? So our boundary API is where we set up the logger, and it will have an ID, right? A unique ID, and our classes, our objects from other files should be aware of the ID in order to write the execution details at the right location. Once we have our controller object, we will execute the method collect financial data, and it should receive acronym name as an argument in order to know which data about which company should be collected. Once the result is ready, we are returning it back to our user. Cool. And since our application knows what to do, it can receive requests. All that is needed right now is to start it. So we use the run method, right? Our host for now is gonna be localhost. We will be using the default port, and we would like our bottle application to be quiet, which basically means that it should not write anything into our CLI, because we've configured it to use a logger. Before we wrap up this video, obviously there are two methods left to implement, right? So we're talking about the SetupLogger and we're talking about LogicFor. Let's start with an easier one, the SetupLogger. SetupLogger is not gonna have any complicated logic, right? So first of all, we have to initiate the logger object. We will create a variable logger and use the getLogger method that we have imported from the login module. We will be passing our logger unique ID, which is gonna be data gathering main service. Now, at first there will be no logger object, right, which is how it's gonna be initiated, and at later stages when getLogger is called, it instead of initiating an object once again, it will return an existing one. With our logger object being initialized, we are ready to tell it how detailed it should be, right? So logger point set level is going to be a debug, right? In addition to seeing what methods are invoked, we would also like to see the arguments, their names and the values. Since we are going to write the log output to a file, we should create some kind of a file handler, right? So file handler, and we will call the constructor file handler that we have imported from the login module, and its argument is going to be the destination file where it should write the output. So it's gonna be data gathering main service point log. Now, since I've only mentioned the file name, it will be created inside the directory where we are executing our program. And we should keep in mind that our starting point is always going to be the main.py file, which is located right under the stock counselor root directory. And data gathering main service point log is expected to be created at the directory level of main.py file. Cool. Now let's initiate the level of details for our file handler, and yeah, obviously it's gonna be a debug as well. And our file handler should know how to write the messages, right? How exactly to write our log messages to the file. So we will set a formatter by calling a constructor formatter, and we won't do anything fancy, right? We receive a message, we write a message, that's it. The last thing to do is to add to our logger the file handler so that it will actually write to a file. And now for the fun part, which I have left for last. The log-to-logger method that receives function as an argument. First things first. Our function is a function, and our log-to-logger method will return a decorated function. Well, how it's gonna do it? Easy. We will define an internal, as you can see, log-to-logger function with an underscore, right? Underscore implements no one outside of log-to-logger scope should call the underscore log-to-logger function directly. Now let's suppose that we're in the future and log-to-logger is written and implemented. Well, in that case, we should return underscore log-to-logger as a result of our log-to-logger method, and this is functools at their best. Now to the content of the internal function. Well, first of all, we tell that we are decorating an fn argument, and the special keywords asterisk args, asterisk asterisk key w args represent the original arguments that have been passed to the fn argument. Now let's keep in mind that we expect log-to-logger method be called only by our bottle application, which is why we will always have request and response objects. And as you can see, the very first step in our internal method is to store the request's time of arrival. We're gonna do it by creating a request time variable and call the datetime point now. Request time is actually the only data that we would like to store before the fn execution. So at line 49 we can execute the function that has been given to us as an argument. We will store its result in the actual response variable, and well, we execute the function by calling it with the arguments originally and intended for it, right? So it's args and kw args. Cool. Now, before returning the response of the executed function, we would like to log the details of the execution. How we're gonna do it? Well, first of all, we need the logger object, and we're gonna get it with the help of the get oops, okay, we're back. Get logger method that needs the logger ID, which is data gathering main service. Okay, cool. Now an interesting thing to note here that is that by this point of flow, our logger object would have been initiated, right? It will exist. So the getLogger method knows to pull the existing object and return it instead of creating a new logger object, which is actually cool because, well, it reduces from us the need to code something like a singleton pattern for the logger object. Nice. At line 55, we are set and ready to log some details. So we will access our logger object and call the info method. First of all, let's format our message, right? So at the first place, we would like to see the user's IP address, which is the point of the request origination, right? Then we would like to know the request time of arrival. After it, the request method, which can be get, put, post. There are a couple of request methods. And we would like to know the URL to which the request was sent, and the last piece of data is response status, right? So after executing the fn function, our bottle framework will have initiated a response object, and we would like to know its status. If it's 200, everything is okay, but it can be also, for example, 500, internal server error, etc. There are a couple of options. Okay, now that our format is ready, we are passing the values, right? So we're going to the request object, and remote address has our user's IP. Request time has, well, the time of the request. Request object point method goes next. After it goes request point URL, and the last one is that of the response, right? And we're interested in status. Okay, now to finish our internal method, all we need to do is return the actual response of the fn function. Nice. And with that last line being written, we have actually finished our boundary logic implementation, at least till the version 1.0. So let's summarize. What we will be doing next week is implementing our controller of logic, and we will start with the collect financial data method. Now, I hope that during this video you've had as much fun as we had, right? If you have any questions, you obviously can post them in the comment section, but you're also welcome to hit me, Max, directly on my Twitter profile, or my teammate Gabro, who's actually behind most of the code here, at his Twitter profile, and we will do our best to answer, as accurately and as detailed as possible. So, ladies and gents, without further ado, have a nice week, and we will see you next Wednesday.